Well, we're not very far into the history of the northern kingdom, but we're already about to see the end of the second dynasty or the second family of kings who would reign over that nation. You know, when we stop and we think about what we've already seen, even in these very early days of these divided kingdoms, the lack of stable leadership, the swiftness of Israel's decline, it's truly startling when we compare what we see in that nation with what we saw, especially last week in the lesson that we looked at with King Asa and this time of peace and prosperity and faithfulness in the land of Judah. But I wish I could tell you that the worst is behind us. But it's not. For we find that the kings of Israel are only going to get worse and worse. In fact, it seems that these kings, as they came along, they would try to outdo the one before them in the amount of evil that they would engage in. We find that when Baasha was killed, he had a son by the name of Elah. Elah came to reign over Israel during the 26th year of Asa's reign in Judah. Now remember, Baasha and Asa have already had their spat, have already had their issue over people wanting to leave Israel and go to Judah because of the peace and the tranquility, the prosperity that was taking place there. And we know that this was a poor decision on Asa's part. He did not turn to the Lord. He turned to a pagan king. He turned to the king of Syria to aid him in that effort. And as a result of that, this period of peace came to an end in the southern kingdom. But Asa had been reigning for 26 years at the time that Baasha was killed and his son Elah rose to the throne. Elah would have one of the shortest reigns of any of these kings. He would reign for only 2 years. And he reigned from a city called Tirzah. Now I think it's important for us to take just a moment and discuss a little bit of the background about this city, because it's one that is going to play a major role as we move forward looking at these kings. Tirzah was located in the mountains of Manasseh. It was a place that was noted for tremendous beauty. In fact, if you look at Song of Solomon chapter 6 and verse 4, it is specifically mentioned by name as a place of great beauty. In fact, the Hebrew word Tirzah literally means pleasant or lovely. Tirzah was already, and get this kingdom has not been in establishment very long, but they've already gone through 3 capital cities. Tirzah was the third capital, and all 3 of those capital cities were established during the reign of the first king, Jeroboam. He would stay in a place for a while, then he'd move on somewhere else. And then he'd stay there for a while, and he'd move on somewhere else. And eventually they settled upon the capital being Tirzah. But it wouldn't remain there. We find that the capital would remain at Tirzah during the reigns of Baasha, Elah, Zimri, and halfway through the reign of Omri, who would be the one who would eventually move the capital city to Samaria. But later, we're going to find years down the line, another dynasty of kings comes to power. A king by the name of Shallum is reigning in Samaria, reigning over that northern kingdom, and a rival king is going to rise to power and threaten his reign. A man by the name of Menahem. And Menahem's charge, his home base, was going to be Tirzah. And so this was almost going to be like the people saying, you know what, this is someone that's going to take us back to the way that it used to be. He's going to take us back to the glory of this beautiful city. But we find that things are not going to turn out well during that incident, and we'll get to discussing that when we get to those kings. But we're going to find that this city is going to play an important role as we look at the next few centuries of Israelite history. But getting back to King Elah is another king that we really don't know much about. Very little is recorded about him, although, as with some of the other kings, 1 Kings 16 and verse 14 tells us that he did accomplish some things in his 2 years. But the fact that the things that he accomplished were not worth being remembered, were not worth being chronicled in God's Word. God's silence about his accomplishment speaks volumes in retrospect to the things that we are told about this man, which granted is very little. So what happened with Elah? What do we know about this man? Folks, all we know about Elah is 2 years into his reign. He threw a party. He got drunk. He was there. He had this great feast taking place there in the beautiful city of Tirzah. Eat, drink, and be merry was his mantra, seemingly. But we find that the text tells us that he was drinking heavily. What do you think he was drinking? Water? No. He was drunk. He was drunk. The way the text reads, it seems that the dulling of Elah's mind as a result of drinking excessive amounts of alcohol caused him to be unaware of the fact that Zimri was conspiring against him. Zimri, ironically, was the commander of Elah's chariots. He was one of his trusted soldiers. But we find that Elah was a part of this curse that had been brought against this second dynasty of kings. Because they did not turn the nation back to God, because they continued in the sins of Jeroboam, you remember, God made the statement there in 1 Kings 16 verses 1 through 4 that all of the household of Baasha would be put to death. They would be removed from the throne just as we saw with Jeroboam and his descendants. And so what happens, Zimri, he sneaks in, he waits until Elah is very, very inebriated, waits till his responses and his ability of discernment are greatly hindered, and he comes in, he kills Elah, and he claims the throne for himself. It's not much to be remembered for, is it? Well, what was taking place, as I just mentioned, because of the sin of Elah's father, Baasha, because he allowed idolatry to continue to take place in that land, as we see, as I mentioned, 1 Kings 16, 1 through 4, the prophet Hananiah comes and he prophesies to Baasha initially, telling him that the very thing that he had carried out against Jeroboam and his descendants is now going to be carried out against him and his descendants. So now we find that no sooner does Zimri kill Elah and assume the throne, he goes in and he completely destroys the entire family of Baasha. Men, women, and children. Just as God had said would happen. But folks, we need to understand, when we look at stories like this, folks, Elah was not an innocent bystander. This was not something that was not fair, was not just. This was not something that he didn't see coming. The prophets had said this was going to happen. Now, he didn't know when it was going to happen. He didn't know how it was going to happen. And he didn't know at whose hand it was going to take place. But he knew. He knew. And even though this prophecy had already been handed down, notice he did nothing to change the things that God was judging them about. Even though he knew that his life and the life of his entire family unit is going to be destroyed, he still let idolatry continue. He did nothing at all to try to stop it. He just continued on. Well, a couple of principles that we see here. First and foremost, folks, we cannot ignore the danger of indulging in beverage alcohol. We've talked about this in a lot of different lessons in the past. I have shared my conviction with you that I feel like that in our day and time, with all of the advances that we have in food and drink and things of that nature, I personally do not believe that there is ever a reason for a Christian to engage in drinking beverage alcohol. That's just my conviction. I know that some disagree, have different points of view on that. But looking at it from a cultural standpoint, from a standpoint of the differences, and like I said, we've discussed all this in the past, so we won't go into detail, but the differences in alcohol today compared to alcohol then, the purposes of it then compared to now, it's completely different. But whenever we look at the Scriptures, look at how many examples we have of people who fell into the sin of drunkenness. But so many people want to make the argument, well, it's not sinful unless you get drunk. But one thing that science has proven, it is very difficult, the more alcohol you drink, it is very difficult for you to gauge how alert or how drunken you are. And so the more you take in, you really don't have any way of knowing. You don't have any way of determining when to stop, when that cutoff point is, when you reach the point that your mind truly is altered and your abilities of discernment are diminished. It's difficult, if not impossible, for someone to judge that when they are under the influence already. And so we're better off just to not imbibe in it whatsoever. Just to leave it alone. It's dangerous.
The way I look at that is, if you had any amount you drink, no matter what you drink, to me, I feel like every swallow you take is that much closer to being drunk. I mean, you're 1% drunk. Every swallow you take. I mean, if you look at it that way.
Well, and something to keep in mind also with that, and this is a question that has been brought up, question and answer night and other times. Folks, we're not talking about using medications that have alcohol in it. We're not talking about things of that nature. We're talking about drinking alcohol just for the sake of drinking alcohol, for its beverage use. That's something that we really need to stop and consider if that's something wise for a Christian to imbibe in. And like I said, I shared my conviction with you. And like I said, I know some differ to certain degrees on that. And that's okay. I mean, we can discuss those matters. But ultimately, I think that we all would agree. Drunkenness is sinful. Drunkenness is excess. And the excess of anything is sinful. And so we need to be very careful of that. And like I said, the point I'm making, we just need to know the danger that's there. We need to keep that in mind. But also, folks, this is something that I think that a lot of people fall prey to, and they don't even really give a second thought to it. Folks, following the traditions of our ancestors is not an acceptable excuse to sin. Elah was simply doing what Daddy did. He was simply leading the way that Grandpa led. He was continuing their legacy. He could make that argument, couldn't he? But folks, if my dad does something that is sinful, and I continue that, am I sinning because I'm following a tradition? Yeah, if it's sinful. But Elah could have made that same excuse for continuing with idolatry. We're just doing what we've always done. That's what Israel's always done. Ever since we separated from Judah and formed this separate nation, this is how we've always operated. Well, folks, Elah faced God's justice because he continued in the sins of his father. He was the one who was held accountable for that because he could have put a stop to it. He could have changed. But ultimately, What it comes down to is every person has to decide for themselves what they're going to do. You know, it's like Joshua in Joshua 24:15, a very common passage. Joshua said that if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. So starting out, let's stop right there. Notice he said, you know what, if you're listening to what the priests are saying, if you're listening to what I'm saying, if you're seeing the things that God is doing, but for some reason you feel like that's not the right thing to do, you have the choice. If you want to serve the gods of the Egyptians, go for it. You want to serve the gods of the Canaanites, you go for it. You certainly have that right. But notice how he ends that. He says, but as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. It's a personal decision. It shouldn't be based upon what our ancestors have done. It should not be based upon what mom and dad have done. It should be based upon what we know to be the truth. We make that decision. Elah didn't do that. As a result, he lost his life. And his entire family line was killed, keeping them from rising to the throne.